to even begin?
Hard 6.
Hello beautiful people. So I'm here to do the thing that I said I was doing for a while now. Julie, do the thing. So I have been so excited to do this project. It was just a lot of fun for me, and I haven't been able to create something of my own for so long. So I was so excited to come up with the idea, do it, and just even making prosthetics I haven't done for a little bit. So giving myself the opportunity to do it was so much fun, to design it, to make it, to mold it.
To pop it, twist it, do it. Batteries not included.
To then making the prosthetic itself after having sculpted the design and everything, and then applying it to myself, which I still do not like wearing prosthetics, but it was fun. And we had so much fun doing it. We had one of our friends come over and help film it for me, and it was just so much fun. And I'm so thankful to Luke. Thank you for coming and helping me out. You didn't have to, but you took the time out to help me, which I'm really thankful for, so thank you. But yeah, so basically I transformed myself into a Stray Kids Maniac. And before you think to yourself, what is that? What does that even mean? I got the idea after Stray Kids' newest album comeback, which is their Oddinary MIDI album. And after listening to the song countless of times, I learned the choreography because it just seemed like so much fun to do. And I love the whole message behind not even just the song, but the whole album being called Oddinary, is that everyone has a part of them that is not considered normal or like ordinary. And everyone in themselves has something that people don't want to show, like they want to mask from everyone else. And the song and the album celebrates that. It celebrates everyone's differences and everyone's unique abilities and interests and all that sort of stuff. So I found that super liberating, and also just taking inspiration from something is something that I haven't done for so long, that it was really creatively inspiring again to actually create something of my own and not someone else's work for a job. It was a long few weeks, and by weeks it's probably been maybe a couple months now, of planning, making things, ordering things, making sure things arrive on time, organizing things not very well because then realizing I need more stuff. And it's been a long process of creating and planning. This video, as I've been editing it, as I've been filming all the pieces, so like making the prosthetics and all that sort of stuff, painting them, would be literally probably 5 hours long if I didn't time lapse or speed up a lot of clips. So this video isn't going to be necessarily an entirely informative video on making prosthetics and applying them. Just for time wise, this video would have been super long. So if you guys want, comment down below, and if you're interested, I can take the footage that I filmed and do a more in-depth explanation as to what I did, what I used, how I came to the complete process. And hopefully that's something you guys are interested in, because there is a lot that goes into making prosthetics, especially ones that you are making yourself. It is a lot of fun, but there are also so many tips and tricks that I have learnt along the way that has made the process a lot more streamlined, but also things that you would have never thought to guess. Making sure you use vinyl gloves, not latex gloves, because if the silicone touches the latex, it's not going to cure properly. Things like that. So there's just a lot of information that I would love to share if you guys want me to. So I don't want to drone on and on and on about stuff that you may not be interested in. If you guys are, please specify that and I will do that dedicated video, as well as the applying of the prosthetics, because that in itself is another thing. You'll see me doing it. But it is, again, it's a bit more of an intensive process with a bit more explanation and stuff like that. So I don't want to bore you guys to high heaven about it. I just want to show you how I got to the end result. Okay, so starting this look, I ended up purchasing some tape-in extensions. These are the lightest ones I could find. And you can see they're still a little bit on the yellow side. So I'm going to shampoo these in some purple shampoo, see what color I get. Hopefully I don't have to tone them even more of a white color. So I'm going to do that. You have to shampoo extensions when you first get them anyway. If you plan to dye them, it will just help the dye to take better because it's coated in like a silicone protective stuff. Something in my sink, I don't know what it is, but yes. Then come back and find your cat has taken your seat. She's so cute. Okay, so you can see the color difference here in between the packet and these freshly purple shampooed extensions. You can see they're so much whiter and cooler tone, and I was happy with that. So then I decided to dye them this beautiful green color. So I decided on green just because it's what Changbin has in the music video, and I really liked the look of the dark black hair against like the neon green, and I thought it encapsulated Maniac and Oddinary with the whole green tone really well. So I'm using this particular dye from Directions in fluorescent green. So I ended up, in order for the dye to take better, I ended up blow drying the extensions dry, and now I'm just going to apply the fashion color. Make sure that you work the dye in really well in order to get every single strand. Then I ended up flipping the extensions just to add more dye on the other side and make sure that it is all evenly coated. Because this is going to be in my head for probably a few months, I want them to look good and also last very long. Last long. So yeah, just make sure that they're really well done. Obviously you can't do this with synthetic extensions. These have to be real human hair. A big thank you as well to my friend Jules for cutting my hair and applying these tape-in extensions in. I could not have done it without you because applying them to myself would have been a bit difficult. So thank you so much, Jules. Love you. I let that sit on the extensions for about, I think, 20 minutes, and then I rinsed them out in some warm water, and then I just let them to air dry. So this is what the tape-in extensions look like now that they're in. After that, I ended up starting to sculpt for the prosthetic pieces. So this is a particular sculpting clay that they use specifically for prosthetics, and it is like an oil-based clay, so it doesn't dry out. You can reuse it as many times as you want. So you can sculpt a particular project and then use that same clay years later, hopefully, if you've looked after it. And this particular one is actually a little bit hard, so you need a bit of warmth. You can get softer ones, but because in Australia it gets quite hot and you don't want it too soft that it ends up melting, because you actually can melt this down into a more liquidy consistency and pour it into a mold. That way you can then sculpt directly onto it once it's cooled down, which is pretty cool. So this stuff can be a little bit expensive. So now I'm starting the basis of the sculpt, and basically I am creating the hole that the bolt is going to be protruding out of. So this is going to look like flesh. It's going to look like the bolt has sort of exploded out of this particular area. So I'm working really hard to get the edges really smooth, because as smooth as you can get it is how flush to your skin you're going to get it. So I've created that hole and tried to create all the little bits as I can that sort of create that skin to sort of look like it's been bored out of the skin, for lack of a better term. And now I'm just making the bolt. So I've taken some nail art tools actually to help with this, because they're super tiny. And I'm creating the little rivets that the screw has going around it. So this was actually a lot easier than I thought it was going to be. I was predicting that this sculpt was going to be super time consuming, but once I sort of had it planned out how I wanted it in my head, it just ended up sort of working out, which I was quite thankful for. And sculpting is just sort of, you know, having to just think of how to do it, and because I've been doing it for years, it comes as second nature a bit. But yeah, it takes a lot of practice basically. I'm just smoothing these areas a little bit now that I've pushed the little long snake that I created around the bolt. So now I'm just smoothing those bits, and I will do more smoothing soon. So I've got it that far. I've already made sure that it fits in my little wound hole. That sounds really weird, but let's not dwell on that. So I got it to that point. It's looking good. And now I'm taking this product called Shellite, and this is basically lighter fluid, so I don't suggest kids do this without parents around. But basically Shellite melts the clay, so it helps give a really smooth appearance. So this really helps to make sure that everything is really smooth and clean and looks like it doesn't have, like it wasn't sculpted, so it just gives that effect that you want basically at the end result. You don't want all that texture coming up in the mold itself, so you want it to be really smooth. And after that, I placed it into the wound and just sort of manipulating the clay around it as to how gaped I want the, this is sounding really weird, but so trying to get the skin that has been broken around the bolt how I want it to look, basically. Giving it some texture and smoothing it. On a side note, trying to not have this sound sexual is really difficult. When you're trying to sculpt wounds, it's a thing. It's a thing. Then I'm using Shellite again and smoothing out some bits that I didn't like, and also making sure that the skin portion of the wound is as smooth as it can be and as flush to the board as possible. Now just making the hexagonal top. Probably an easier way that I found to do this is actually print out an hexagon with the same size that you want, and then use that as like a template to cut it out, because I soon figured out trying to cut out a hexagon is super difficult. So I managed to do that. Now I'm just neatening up the edges, making sure that it's as crisp as I can get it. And that's how I got to that. Now I'm just sticking it on top, making sure that it's going to stay in place. What I did end up doing though is adding texture to the actual bolt itself to make it look as close to metal as possible. So I ended up sort of doing scrapes and all these little things on it just to give it that really metallic texture, because when it ends up being painted, I could accentuate them with the paint and make it look as realistic as possible. And now that I am done with the sculpting, I'm ready to create the mold itself. Now this mold, I can use it for as long as I can, basically, until it breaks. So I am now creating the wall that will go around the sculpt, And this wall is going to hold all of this silicone in place when I pour it in to create the mold. And I created this ring around the bolt as well, and that's going to create a little pool in the mold, so it has something to hold on to when I pull the silicone in to create the prosthetic. And when I was filming this, I thought I pressed record to record me pouring the silicone in and weighing it out and everything, because it's a 2-part ratio. It cut out on me, so here it is, poured in, and it's now cured. So I'm going to remove the walls and pray that the silicone took to the mold well and that I got every single bit of detail that I want. And I decided to use a silicone mold for this because obviously it's flexible, and because this was going to be a mold that has a lot of undercuts and a lot of deep bits, like here with the bolt being stuck in there. I need it to be able to be flexible so I can push out the prosthetic. So now I have made some plastic caps. So you dilute it with acetone, and this creates the skin that holds the prosthetic in place. So it's kind of like the fake skin that we're going to apply, and encapsulating the silicone when we pour it is going to allow us to use Prosaid as the adhesive, so we don't have to spend a lot of money on a silicone adhesive. So this is the skin safe silicone that we're going to use to fill the prosthetic, and it's going to create the flesh and the bolt part of it. And this is what's going to give it the squidginess but also the rigidity. So I'm just powdering the plastic cap because it's sticky and I don't want that to sort of affect anything. So this, you have to make sure if you're making prosthetics, you have to use a skin safe silicone, because obviously you don't want anything weird happening with your skin. So I'm really getting the baby powder in there so it can really, be ready to use. And every silicone that I know of is a 2-part, so you have to do equal amounts of A and B, and once you mix them together, the curing process starts, and that's when it starts to harden. There are additives that you could use with silicone that will make it dry faster, dry slower, make it more floppy so it's not as rigid, which is what you would usually use if you want it to be super skin-like, but because I am using it with a bolt in it as well, I wanted the bolt to be as hard as possible, and the amount of skin that the prosthetic has isn't that much, so the fact that it isn't super floppy or anything like that didn't really concern me. It was more that bolt, getting it to look as realistic and as stiff as possible for the prosthetic. So here I have mixed up some of that silicone. I'm adding some flocking powder, so I'm adding some red and some blue flocking powder because it almost looks like the broken capillaries that are in the skin, so it gives that effect that there are veins popping through and all that sort of stuff, as well as tinting it to be more of a skin color. So here I'm mixing with the part B and putting it into the mold, and this is the most nerve-wracking part, because I'm trying to make sure that it is going all the way down into the mold and getting all the crevices and all of the detailed bits that we've created, which is why doing this kind of mold can be difficult, because obviously you don't know what's happening all in there, and you want the silicone to be completely filled up into every single crevice of that mold. So after that, I am just cleaning up the excess that is on the prosthetic, because we are using a acetone dissolvable product, which is the plastic cap. We want to make sure that no excess silicone is preventing that plastic cap from being dissolved when we have to apply it. So I'm cleaning up all the excess silicone, making sure that that's not going to be an issue when we go to applying it, because then we want that plastic cap to be as thin as possible so we don't have to use a bondo, which we'll be showing later on. So after I've removed that excess silicone, I'm just using more plastic cap to encapsulate that silicone. So just adding more of that. So adding a couple layers and powdering as well in between, because it is a sticky layer and you don't want to be removing what you have just put down. So for this first prosthetic, I think I made the plastic cap layer too thick, which you will see when I remove it, because it's just not as thin as I wanted it to be. And that then I had to use Bondo, but also having to apply it on yourself is a little bit difficult anyway. So it kind of helps having a bit of a thicker plastic cap layer, just because it's not as fragile, but there is a lot more work that goes into it to make it look more realistic as well. So I'm demolding it using some powder to make sure that it's not sticky and doesn't stick to itself, and trying to pull it out of the mold very carefully. And obviously this one, it was the first one, it didn't turn out as perfectly as I'd hoped. There was, weird bubble bits and bits that were really craggly and not very pretty looking, and not so much like the sculpt that I created. But because of that, I thought to myself, you know what, I'm not going to get rid of it, I'm going to use it. I learned a lot from making that first prosthetic as to what I had to do in order to make the second one look exactly like how I sculpted it. So making sure that all the edges in the mold are filled with plastic cap, and just doing different techniques in order to make it work, which thankfully it did. I'm not going to lie, but when I pulled that prosthetic piece out of the mold, the first one that I made, and saw that it wasn't quite perfect, it wasn't exactly how I had molded it, because the plastic cap just didn't seem to reach the places I had hoped, because having it be a deep mold, it can be really hard to get things even and to get the product in there correctly, as well as when you have to powder it and things like that. So when I pulled the prosthetic out of the mold, I was a little bit disheartened. I knew that, it's the first prosthetic that I made in that mold, so I hadn't learned the things that I had learned when I made the prosthetic the second time for the second bolt. But I decided to keep it, because like the whole message of the album and the song is that nothing's perfect. And why not use it? Why waste money and create another perfect prosthetic when I can just use the one that I got and enhance it further? So I ended up using the imperfections of that prosthetic to make it look rusty, to make it look like that bolt was unscrewed a long time ago and has just been left there before this new bolt has unscrewed itself and, set free my final form. But I wanted to make sure that in art, sometimes your mistakes can lead to an even better idea or an even more thought out world, because in my brain, I was just like, okay, I want to make these perfect. I want to make sure that everything works out well. But as a creative person, you have to let go of that sometimes, because not everything's going to be perfect. Also, things go wrong. It was the first time I've made that prosthetic in that mold. I didn't quite get my technique down that time because I wasn't sure what I was doing in order to get the best out of that mold. So of course, when it came to the second bolt, which turned out to be perfect, like even you'll see in the reveal, in the first bolt, I made the plastic up a little bit too thick. So applying it on myself is a bit too hard to then conceal those edges. But I worked with what I got, and that's the result. And I absolutely, there's a hair in my mouth. Ugh. I absolutely love how that rusted bolt turned out. And it was one of my favorite like painting experiences, because I love trying to make things look super realistic. I really got into trying to bring that sort of rust effect out by using eyeshadows and other ink palettes, and the tones that I used and everything like that. Really sort of vibrant yellow and oranges that can come out with rust. It was really like a great learning curve as well if I do anything in the future that involves those sort of techniques. So it was really fun to play around with that, and to not be scared of failing, because if you do end up messing it up royally and having to start again, then that's just what you have to do. So sometimes you have to take a bit of a risk in order to get your creative reward, like anything in life.
Hard 6.
Now that both prosthetics are dry and ready, I have a few other pieces that I didn't end up using, but if you want me to use them in a different video, please let me know. But basically, I have 2 other pieces that I had created a few years ago, and I was like, well, let me just paint them, and I have them there if I want to use them and add a little bit more of a different effect. I thought they might be make the look a bit too gory and a bit too over the top, so I didn't end up using them. But you can see here how I ended up painting each of the pieces to how I sort of wanted the look to go. So this is probably my favorite part of creating prosthetics and applying them, because I love the actual painting process. I like trying to make things look as realistic as possible. So I'm taking my alcohol inks. I was hoping that these would actually work and stick as well as I'd thought, and because we had encapsulated the silicone in plastic cap, it means that it would, which I'm very happy about that. So as I was actually creating this file, I wasn't talking, didn't have anything on the background, so it was actually pretty relaxing just hearing the ASMR aspect of this. So if you would like me to upload this as like a little ASMR video, please let me know, because I thought it was just super relaxing just listening to the flicking sounds of the paintbrush and the opening of the containers and things like that. Yeah, this is the bolt that didn't turn out too well the first time, so I've created it to be like a rusty bolt that has been protruding for a while. So I really had fun trying to make it look aged and rusted, and using, you know, the oranges and the yellows that I probably wouldn't have otherwise. I also started to use some eyeshadows that I have, so like yellow and some orange eyeshadows, just to really give that dusty textured effect that metal tends to get when it starts to rust. So you can see that it starts to like get powdery and flaky, which you can see here. And when it comes to the other bolt, it came out of the mold perfectly, and I was super happy about that because it was exactly how I had envisioned it. And I was super excited to get to do a different sort of look for a different bolt. So I kind of got to play around with both different styles and creativities to make things look realistic. So I'm adding a red layer to this and really sort of trying to make it look realistic. I ended up tearing the plastic up a bit too much because this one was a bit too thin. So I tried to repair it a little bit, which ended up working for the most part. I made it work anyway for me. One thing that you have to remember as well is that when working with alcohol inks, and if you use a lot of them, like a bit too watery, or alcoholed watery version, it might still affect the plastic cap if it's really thin, so just be aware of that. Don't make the same mistakes I did. So just flicking on the alcohol inks, trying to make it look as real as possible. We end up using the flicking method most often when doing these kind of works, like tattoo cover and trying to blend a prosthetic into the skin, because it's usually the most realistic way of doing, you know, skin to skin matching when it's obviously not their skin. Just because flicking the paint is going to be a lot more realistic than applying with a sponge or a brush, because you can get that really randomized effect, and it's almost like airbrushing, which is really cool. But here I'm using now a black and a silver to make the bolt look as realistic as possible. So this is the newer bolt that has emerged from my face. And I'm just trying to get that to look as metallic and as realistic, as real metal as possible. Sorry, I keep moving the prosthetic out of view. I wasn't aware that I was moving it too much out of frame when I was filming this. So now just using some alcohol paints just to put the redness in, adding some red on the bolt like it has actually come out of my skin. Now I'm adding some scab blood in here at the moment, but I also thought, because I kind of just wanted to see what it looked like, but in hindsight I wouldn't put this on right now. I would wait until it is actually applied onto the skin to put fake blood, because it just ends up getting all over your fingers and getting sticky. Okay, so this took a while, but with the help of my boyfriend, I am setting up the garage. We're putting up some plastic, basically the paint sheets that you use to protect the floor, because they were like $1 each. So we used a bunch of them to hide the shelves in our garage, but also to create a backdrop. So while we were putting that up, I was trying to think on how to actually make this look cool, because in my head I was like, we can use that, but then it can almost look like a, you know, when they're doing renovations and they have all that plastic sheeting just chilling around. But then I was like, you know what, screw it, I can, you know, spray paint stuff. So I just thought about this on the spot and just started to spray paint, because I thought it worked well with the whole theme. And then I did my hair in rollers. I didn't want to film this whole thing because my boyfriend's sleeping in the background there. But yes. And then we came to the day. Back here. We have fun here. I'm gone for literally 2 seconds and look who's already in my seat.